Alright guys, Murph's here, and today at viewer request we're going to discuss how often you should clean your firearm. But we're going to do more than just simply state how often it is that you should be cleaning your firearm. We're going to go into some of the nuance that might dictate times where you need to immediately clean your firearm, or perhaps times where a little bit, having a set schedule and all that kind of stuff is the more appropriate answer. Overcleaning, undercleaning, all those types of things. All things cleaning will be discussed here today. Now, something that's important to keep in mind to kind of like frame and scope this overall discussion. I'm not talking about like your gun just took a nosedive in a mud puddle. That is something that is an obligatory immediate cleaning. At the very least, making sure that the bore is not in some way obstructed by either packed in mud or like small rocks or anything along those lines. You do not want to have a high pressure event in your firearm while you're actively trying to shoot it. What we are going to be talking about is more like the maintenance side of cleaning. You've been shooting the gun quite a bit, you've been taking it to courses, you've been taking it to competitions, you've been going afield with it and stuff like that. When are times when you should 100% clean your firearm? When we talk about cleaning, we're talking about either removing the residue from having fired the gun, so we're talking about carbon, brass shavings, all those types of things that'll collect in the firearm as it operates, as well as external environmental factors, dust, sand, dirt, water, all those types of things. That's what we're talking about whenever it is that we're saying cleaning in this case. Now you have some guys out there that will fire thousands of rounds before they clean their gun. And they're like the same kind of person who, their dashboard is telling them in their car that they need to stop and get gas. And they're like, I know my car. I know how far I can push this. And then you have other guys that are absolutely neurotic about it and they clean their gun like every day, regardless of whether or not they've really been shooting it all that much. And honestly, the best answer is somewhere in between, because both of those people are potentially doing harm to their firearms. And that might be surprising to hear when I say that like cleaning your gun every day could be potentially detrimental. It's no different than walking the same path through grass every day. You're going to eventually leave a furrow. It's the same thing depending on your cleaning practices whenever it is that you're cleaning your firearm. Depending on the type of practices that you're using, the types of tools, the measures that you go about in your cleaning process and all that kind of stuff, you could very well cause damage to the firearm. And I think the most notable example of this would be swapping the bore, and specifically protection of the muzzle. Now, something that's important to remember about the muzzle of any type of single projectile firearm, so slug guns, rifles, and pistols, is that is the last contact your gun has with a bullet before it completely exits the bore and goes downrange to do as it is supposed to do. Any damage to the muzzle could potentially impact the accuracy of that weapon system. That's why a lot of times you'll see like crowned muzzles, or why muzzle devices in general are really good attributes of a firearm to protect the muzzle. If you go cleaning from the muzzle end of the gun, your cleaning rod, depending on its construction, could potentially damage the muzzle. So if you're using a brass rod, this won't necessarily be all that big of a deal, but if you're using like steel rods or something along those lines, it will be an issue. Now, some of you with your Property Pony AR-15s out there, with no-name barrels and stuff like that, your steel of your barrel actually might be soft enough to be damaged by a brass rod. Now, there are a couple things that you can do. You can put a spacer that your cleaning rod will run through the center of so that you don't necessarily mar the bore, or mar the muzzle. But the best option is to clean from the chamber end of the barrel, and even better yet is to utilize a bore snake, which will really help reduce the possibility of damage to the bore, as well as an appropriate sized brush. Now, the guy who only cleans once every couple thousand rounds, he's potentially doing a lot of damage to the small springs and stuff like that that make up any semi-automatic or any multi-shot system. Even breech loaders still have springs and such that are associated with them. And we're talking about the springs and the extractors and the ejectors and all those types of things. If those things get clogged up with a whole bunch of carbon and stuff like that, then they are going to eventually be damaged, or if they are allowed to get wet, they're going to rust, and that stuff's going to degrade the overall function of the weapon. It's going to take a while. I'm not saying that, oh my God, I fired 1,000 rounds through my gun and now all my springs are destroyed. That's not necessarily going to be the case, but repeated exposure to those types of conditions is going to prematurely wear those parts, and that's something to keep in mind. Small parts breakage is just as bad as a malfunction. It's actually even more deadlining, because that firearm is not going to be, it's not a simple matter of just like swapping away some of the carbon or adding some additional lubricant or something along those lines. That gun's down until it gets fixed. It's not functioning properly until it makes its way to a gunsmith and has that part replaced. Okay, well, Murph, what are some conditions that would be an obligatory cleaning? Like you need to, as soon as you get home from your range trip or whatever it is that you're doing, you need to clean this firearm right now. That would be, for instance, if I was firing corrosive ammunition. Now, for the most part, corrosive ammunition, when we think of that, we think of like Russian surplus ammunition, but once upon a time, all militaries were utilizing corrosively primed ammunition. What does corrosively primed ammunition mean? It means that the primer compound was made up of some type of perchlorate that has, upon firing, leaves behind a salt-like residue which will attract moisture out of the air, causing moisture to gather in your barrel. Regardless of the coatings or the barrel hardness or any of those types of things, long-term exposure to water is not positive for metal, for any type of metal, even if it's chrome-lined. Eventually that stuff will break down. Now, corrosively primed ammunition is not very common anymore. You'll still find it if you come across surplus military ammunition. You should expect that it is corrosively primed, and you can research that stuff. You can research the case heads in order to be able to figure out where it is that it came from and whether or not that ammunition is corrosive. If you shoot corrosively primed ammunition, as soon as you get home, you need to clean your firearm thoroughly with some type of water-based solvent. And then, bing, bang, boom, you're done. Now, since we're talking about like cleaning barrels and stuff like that, why don't we go ahead and talk about things like leading. So, depending on the type of ammunition you're firing, your bullet's leaving behind some type of residue. So if you're shooting hard cast, you're leading the bore, and if you're shooting like any other type of ammunition, you're leaving behind potentially a copper residue. There's a lot of discussion about the impacts that this potentially has on accuracy, and there are solvents out there targeted at cleaning these types of metal deposits out of your bore. As well as a lot of discussion about like the best way to go about all this type of stuff, which then brings us into a discussion of barrel break-in. Now, barrel break-in is where somebody has a particular ritual that they follow whenever it is that they get a new rifle in order to be able to ensure its accuracy. And it's X number of rounds fired, followed by X number of like patches or X amount of cleaning done to the rifle in order to be able to, and you primarily see this with rifles, in order to be able to ensure a certain level of accuracy. I myself am not a precision shooter. Longtime viewers of the channel will know this. So I've never been that broken up about like the difference in, you know, quarter-inch differences in groupings and stuff like that. I am very much so a minute-a-man type of shooter. However, I keep an eye on the PRS crowd, just like I kind of keep a finger on the pulse of a lot of different types of shooting disciplines, because I enjoy shooting in general, and I enjoy talking about these sort of subjects. And I've discussed barrel break-in with some of my friends who are big into precision shooting, as well as I've seen interviews done with world-class precision shooters and had the discussion of barrel break-in come up. Some people that I respect in the field, as well as those world-class shooters, have commented or opined that barrel break-in is not that critical. It's not that important. It's not really changing anything about the rifle. It's not like seasoning a cast iron skillet or anything along those lines. That barrel's pretty well set. Now, of course, there are plenty of people out there who still cling to whatever it is that their belief is, and I don't hold anything against you for that, because in the absolute worst-case scenario, it's a placebo. If following that shooting cleaning regimen gives you the necessary boost in confidence to believe that your rifle is as accurate as it's ever going to be, then that's everything gained at that point, regardless of whether or not it's real. In reality, there's no damage that's caused by following a specific firing regimen. You're not going to break the gun. So all of its positives. Believe in it, don't believe in it, it doesn't really matter. To each their own in this case. All right, now another situation that might cause you to need to immediately clean your firearm is if it takes a dunk. If it, drops into a creek or a puddle or something along those lines, you get caught up in a pretty hefty rainstorm. Water will have a tendency to chase away all of the lubricants or solvents that you've put on the gun, and now leave that metal exposed. So water itself is of course going to be very corrosive to metal, as well as long-term exposure to the elements and all those types of things. If you strip away whatever fine coating it is that you have on there, if you have untreated portions of the rifle, they are now more exposed to some type of corrosion. So the only way to really be able to combat this is, of course, get all the water out of the gun, and then also clean, and lube it. Now, lubrication is where people get into an awful lot of trouble because you can absolutely over-lubricate a gun. And I've known some guys that would absolutely drown a firearm in oil with the belief that that was in some way going to guarantee its reliability. Now, guys, there's a time and a place for that type of thing. If you are living in the field and you're in a condition where you may not necessarily be able to protect the gun from the elements, so it's getting dirt on it, it's getting sand on it, you're spending a lot of time shooting it, and you cannot risk the possibility of disassembling the firearm fully in order to be able to clean it. So we're in like the trenches of Ukraine or something along those lines, where it'd be some really bad luck if you just took your gun apart in the middle, like right before a Russian offensive started. Now you're sitting there with your AK in pieces and you can't fight. That would be problematic. So that's a condition where, sure, if the gun starts to bog down a little bit, starts to get a little sluggish, go ahead and hit it with some CLP or whatever lubricant it is that you have lying around, just to be able to keep it in the fight. Maybe you do a partial strip. You just get the bolt out or something like that. Wipe it down on your sleeve and hit it with some lubrication and throw it back in and get back into the fight. That's completely fine. I'm talking about guys just pooling it up and then setting it in a corner, or pooling it up and then living in those field conditions, because you can still over lubricate in that case as well. And that's where all of that debris from your environment, that's where all the carbon that you have that's potentially flaking off as you put in that oil, as well as the brass shavings and stuff like that, are going to collect in that firearm, and that's not going to be a good long-term result. That stuff will turn into the worst kind of slurry that you've ever seen. That will bog down the gun, because the whole goal here is to not introduce friction. That's what carbon and sand and all these types of things are. It's friction. It's the same thing whenever it comes to lubing the firearm. You want enough on there to decrease the friction between these metal surfaces, but you don't need so much on there that it becomes detrimental to pooling and creating its own sludge. So most manuals and stuff like that will tell you to have a very thin layer of lubrication on surfaces and stuff like that. Okay, well, Murph, I shouldn't over lubricate, and I should clean if I shoot any corrosively primed ammunition and all these types of things. Well, how deep should I clean whenever it is that I clean my firearm? Well, guys, there's a reason that there's a term out there known as field stripping as opposed to detail stripping. So field stripping is supposed to be however far the gun breaks down without the introduction of tools. A tool beyond like a bullet. Because there are plenty of military arms out there that are designed to be able to be disassembled with the tip of the projectile or the, case lip or something along those lines in order to be able to make adjustments or strip the gun down. That's completely fine. That type of tool is acceptable. It's in your environment. I'm talking about like screwdrivers, punches, stuff like that. That's starting to get more towards a detail strip at that point. Any type of fighting weapon system, tactical weapon system, should be able to be disassembled into its base components without tools, enough so for you to be able to clean it and ensure daily function. When you get into detail strip, it's like, okay, well now I'm pulling out the extractors and the other, the firing pin springs and all those types of things in order to be able to make sure all of those parts are properly cleaned. That does not need to be done nearly as often as just a good field strip and lubrication. You have to be especially careful whenever it is that you get into firearms that were not designed to be field use firearms, that were not necessarily designed to have easy stripping available. And I ran into this problem with my Winchester Model 94, which if you're interested in that review, go ahead and check out the link in the description. I take guns apart. That's the thing that I do. I have a lot of different types of firearms. I enjoy taking things apart. I have some mechanical ability. It's not necessarily a savant at it, but I can use simple hand tools and stuff like that. And I decided, I shot my Winchester Model 94 a lot and never really cleaned it. I would go ahead and take it apart and put it back together. How hard could it be? Boy, did I learn. I put that thing together and took it apart 3 times trying to get it to work properly and could not get it accomplished. And at that point, I then had to take it to a gunsmith who put it back together for me and encouraged me to never do that again. So there are some firearms out there when you get into the much older designs that were not meant to be field stripped. So when it comes to cleaning those, the most that you should do is just crack it open. Like now on that Winchester Model 94, I open the action and I scrub and lube whatever it is that I can reach. And I leave it at that. And if that firearm ever starts failing on me, I will take it to a gunsmith who can go ahead and do the detail strip that is required in order to be able to clean that firearm and get it back up and running. You would also run across something fairly similar in the Remington Model 8, which my dad had one of those, and I once started taking it apart, and I stopped early because things were getting a little complicated. Which seems to be something that's very indicative of like FN designed guns as well. I remember talking to a Special Forces team some years ago who said that they had been using like FN pistols and had sidelined them because when it came to maintenance on them, there were a lot of like really small springs in there and stuff like that, and they were a pain to like keep track of and maintain and all those types of things. So then they went like back to Glocks. You know, so this is going back in the days of like the FNX 45 or the FNS pistols and stuff like that. That story's always stuck with me. I found it very interesting at the time. Okay, well, that's kind of the tempo that we're looking for whenever it is that we're talking about like cleaning and some considerations for cleaning and stuff like that. What do you do, Murph? Well, guys, I clean my guns after every range trip. Because not only is it my opportunity to clean my firearm, but it's also my opportunity to inspect my firearm and make sure everything's going the way that it's supposed to. That I don't have any parts breakages coming up, or I haven't broke any parts in the time that I was shooting it and all those types of things. Is that necessary? Well, to me, all firearms are meant to be used in some sort of dynamic way. I don't have wall hangers or anything along those lines. So, for me, I think it's most important to make sure that my guns are always ready. That they are clean and lubricated and prepared to do whatever task it is that I might set them to. If you're using your gun for duty or self-defense or home defense, any of those types of things, any type of dynamic type use, yes, you want your gun in a high state of police. If this is just a fun gun, if this is just something that you shoot upon occasion and you're not shooting anything that's corrosive, you don't have to clean it nearly as often. But in my opinion, all firearms are potentially defensive firearms. Now, they may not necessarily be the ones that you want to fight with, but they might be the ones you have to fight with, given a wide variety of factors. All right, Murph, then how do you go about cleaning and stuff like that? Well, I don't really have a particular cleaner that I love or promote over anything else. I remember some years ago, the very first rifle course I ever took was actually in the pursuit of my profession, and we were in field type conditions and we really couldn't clean the guns that often. Like the most I could do was pop the bolt out of my AR and then like drench it in some type of solvent, throw that thing back in there, and then get back up on the firing line and dump a bunch of rounds. We were going through thousands of rounds. And at that time, I came across ram oil, and I liked ram oil, but I haven't really found one lubricant that I prefer over any others. Like, you know, you got Hickok 45 out there promoting Battlestall and all those types of things. I haven't found it very interesting. For the most part, I use like Hops number 9. I have recently been using this Hops number 9 Gun Medic, and I've got to say, guys, that this thing is overkill. There's not really an in-between, so like if you try to very lightly press the nozzle, you'll get like either this like thing, you know, like it's blowing raspberries, or you get a full-on torrent of oil. There is no in between. It's actually really irritating. I probably will not buy this again. And the idea is supposed to be that like it sprays on really hard and then it evaporates away, and it's supposed to leave behind this like thin like lube and all this kind of stuff, which is super great in theory. However, I use this to be able to break free any carbon, and then I clean all of it off, and then I lubricate right now with this M Pro 7. I don't remember where it is that I got this or even how much it was, but I've been using this as my lubricant because it comes out not nearly as violently, and I can better direct where it is that I want my lubricant to go and the amount that it is that I want to use, because I don't, like I mentioned before, I don't necessarily use a lot of lubricant and stuff like that. I'm not putting guns up wet or anything along those lines. So that's my cleaning practices. On complicated firearms that I should probably take to a gunsmith to disassemble, I just get whatever it is that I can with the action open. For a little while on my surplus rifles, I was taking the bolts apart. That's something I've kind of stopped doing. The bolts are pretty simple. We're probably at a point where I should disassemble the bolts because it's been a few years since I've done so, but I do the best that I can to make sure that I get lubricant in there. And I'm kind of waiting for more or less to start having issues before I really like detail strip those types of things. So those are still, don't get me wrong, the bolts on military surplus rifles are meant to be field serviceable. They're also incredibly simple and over-designed and don't need frequent field servicing unless I was like fighting at Verdun, in which case maybe I should take apart my bolt. My guns don't, my surplus rifles don't get used in that way. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting. It's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.